Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick.
Great to have you in again. And Dr. John, last week we were talking a little bit about the age of the Earth and dating things with carbon dating. And you promised last week that we would talk this week a little bit about radiometric dating, other forms of dating, because, of course, we've looked at carbon dating and it's not particularly accurate. So, of course, there's other methods that scientists use that can actually get older ages.
Yeah, much older ages, Mick. And look, I know we've been on this age of the Earth for weeks, but as you know, it's one of the most common questions we get asked. And your experience with your friends has been that that's all they're on about. You know, how old is the Earth? And,
and as soon as you come up with a good reason for one not working, they'll throw all the others at you.
Yeah, well, that's the question everybody asks, and of course, the reason they do is because we've got this obvious conflict between what the Bible says and what the secular world says. Mm-hmm. And as we've mentioned many times, we say how the Bible says the Earth is only about 6,000 years old, and we've gone into a bit of detail about how you derive that age from the various passages of Scripture. And when you think about it, actually, 6,000 years is quite a long time. You know, if you think back to ancient times, I mean, there was a mention on the news about Solomon's time. Well, that's 3,000 years ago, and that's a long time ago.
Yes.
You know, so 6,000 years is quite a long time. But, of course, we're used to hearing things like 50,000 years and 100,000 years, and that's a very, very much longer time than 6,000. Mm. But then you get into a million. A million's a lot more than that, and then 100 million and billions. I mean, these are just figures that are astronomical. You know, you can't even get your head around them. Mm-hmm. They're so vast.
So how do they measure them?
Well, look, it's like I said, it is various forms of radiometric dating. Now, we talked about carbon dating, which is used really for short times, because you can only get a matter of thousands of years out of carbon dating, even if those years existed, because the half-life of radioactive carbon is quite short in radioactive terms.
Yes.
It's 5,730 years. But some of the half-lives for the other radioactive dating techniques are in the millions and even billions. And this is where they get the long ages from. You can't date rocks and things by carbon dating, because they don't have carbon in them anyway. Mm-hmm. So they have to use all sorts of other techniques. And I suppose the one of the common ones is the decay of uranium to lead. Now, uranium goes through a whole series of decay processes with various elements in between, and it can end up with being lead. Mm-hmm. And of course, by knowing or having a pretty good idea of the half-lives of all those transition elements that have come from the decay of uranium, they can get an idea of the age of the Earth. The age of the rock, supposedly, and of course that comes out in the millions and billions of years. But I'm going to explain a little bit about that in a couple of minutes.
Awesome. You're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Send your questions through to our text line, SMS 0401 949 949. It is 14 minutes past 8. Good Creation Ministries International, who last week was talking to us about radiocarbon dating, and this week we're talking about radiometric dating of other stuff. And you just mentioned uranium earlier, Dr. John, and how it has a much longer half-life. I always have an issue with, when you take it right back to the beginning, what was it then? What happened the day before, the week before, the month before? Was it not a rock then?
Yeah, well, in fact, it wasn't. But this is the whole point, Mick, and I need to make the point to begin with that secular science really has a desperate need to have a technique that will give them millions and billions of years. Mm-hmm. And the reason they need that, of course, is because you can't have evolution without it. So that's why millions and billions of years are going to be defended, and that's why all of these techniques have been devised to try and justify that belief. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned uranium. Well, the things that had been traditionally dated were organic things like bone and wood and so on, and that's where carbon dating came in, because that was the first one that was really explained and used and devised and so on. But of course, it can only give dates in the thousands of years, and you do get these anomalies that things that are believed to be millions of years old, even hundreds of millions, still have radioactive carbon in them, which is an anomalous situation and really scientifically impossible. But then they decided, well, how on earth can we find something that's a bit older than that? And so they turned to the rocks. And rocks that are formed volcanically, like basalts and granites and so on, are the rocks that you can use for so-called rock dating. And you mentioned uranium, and the idea was that when the rock formed, that was the start point. So the time that it came out of the volcano and cooled, that's the starting point. Just like with carbon dating, the time when the tree or the animal died was the starting point. So, with the uranium decaying to lead, uranium decays by what they call alpha decay. It emits helium. It emits alpha particles, which is the nucleus of the helium atom, and it does it through a series of steps. It goes from, say, uranium-238 to uranium-235 to other elements in between before it gets to lead, which is the end point, lead-206. Now, it's assumed, and you have to make this assumption, that you know what was in the rock to start with. Obviously, how can you tell if you don't know what was in it to start with? And of course, you can't go back in time to do that measurement. All you have is the rock now. And so if you measure the amount of uranium in it and you measure the amount of lead in it, then supposedly by working out all the half-lives, you can get to a date for the rock. But you have to assume that there wasn't any lead to start with, that it was all uranium, and that all the lead that you've got now has come from the decay of uranium.
Well, I question, even if it came from magma, you know, the uranium was still in there. It was still decomposing, for want of a better word, and so there would have had to have been some lead in there prior to that day one. I mean, it was always happening if the uranium was there. So it doesn't quite compute with me.
That's a fairly logical conclusion that you've come to, Mick, but to make it work, to make the dating technique work, you have to assume that there was no lead there to start with. You also have to assume, and bear in mind, billions of years is quite a long time. Now, we know that in 6,000 years we've had ice ages and floods and, you know, all sorts of other climatic changes in 6,000 years. How many do you think you're going to get in 5 billion years? You're going to get quite a few. And you have to assume that there's been nothing that has added any more lead or uranium. You have to assume that there's been nothing that's leached out any lead or uranium. So, and you've also got to assume that the decay rates have been constant over billions of years. Well, we've only known a little bit about radioactivity for the last 100 years. And so, you know, going back a few billion, you're making a lot of assumptions that things have always been the same over that period of time. Especially when we know now that things do change. You know, the decay rates can change through temperature and all these other sorts of things. So it's not a really exact science. And I'm going to get on a little bit later to some of the inexact answers that people have come up with.
Absolutely. And of course, if you look at creation, Adam or Eve, they were created at a particular number of years old. They weren't babies when they were created, and so why wouldn't anything else look like it was a little bit older? I mean, it's created to look like something, so the whole Earth could be created the exact same way. And of course, it seems we've just had a little computer crash in the studio. I don't know if you heard it on your end or not, but yes, that was quite an interesting little crash inside the studio. I don't know if it was a power outage or what, although there's a little line come up, says crash recovery engaged. Can I blame Microsoft, Dr. John? Sounds fair, doesn't it?
Yeah, I hope so, Mick.
Oh, that or Micro Mouse. Look, it is 8:28 and we do have the news, weather and traffic coming up soon, but might I just mention to everybody, we have had numerous calls coming through to our mobile phone number, which is for SMS messages to ask Dr. John questions. The number, of course, 0401 949 949. We can't answer that phone and actually hear you audibly. We have to read the messages, SMS messages. That's the only way that particular mobile works. So send those questions through the studio from Creation Ministries International. He's been talking to us for the last few weeks about the age of things. Well, the age of the universe, the age of Earth, and dating methods that evolutionists have sort of come up with. And of course, our creationist point of view. We've also had another question come in, Dr. John, in regards to the age of things. How long was the the post-flood ice age? So that's another question we'll have to get to at some stage. But you've been talking to us this morning, Dr. John, about, I guess, looking at radiometric dating and some of the issues with radiometric dating.
Well, there are plenty of issues, Mick, and of course, one of the reasons I mentioned why the secular scientists really do need millions and billions of years, and that's because of evolution. Because the evolution wouldn't be possible if you didn't have that time frame. But it has to be conceded that one of the reasons why they would believe that time frame is likely to be true is because of the speed of light and the size of the universe. And that's something that I want to talk about next week, how you can reconcile the speed of light and the size of the universe with a short time frame. So listeners ought to tune in again next week, because we'll be covering that one. But look, you would expect, if you could date rocks accurately at millions and billions of years, you would expect that if you actually knew the age of the rock, then you should be able to check yourself out and get the right answer. Yeah. But as it turns out, you can't, or you don't, because there are plenty of volcanic rocks where we know precisely the age, because the volcanic eruption when that rock was formed, and bear in mind it's when the rock was formed that scientists are dependent on for the estimate of the age. You know exactly when that rock was formed because you know exactly when that particular eruption that formed the rock took place.
Yes.
And you would think that you would then be able to check it out and compare the result you got with a rock of known age. Yeah. But as it turns out, rocks that are 100 years old or 50 years old that you know because you know when the volcano erupted, they give dates in the millions and billions of years as well. So if you can't get the right answer when you know what it is, then why would you trust the answer when you don't know what it is? Yes. And, of course, you can always, the science is so elastic that you can always come up with a reason why you got the wrong answer when you should have got a different answer. And one of the things that has amused me is it is so flexible. You can always explain away an anomalous answer. And the flexibility, I want to talk about the way some ages have been derived to show just how flexible it is and how subjective, because the researcher is trying to get an answer that he wants. And one of the things that I think is very amusing is the history of how long Indigenous Australians have been in this country. Now, everybody knows that it's now regarded that they've been here 50,000 years. So where did that figure come from? Well, you need to remember that according to the Bible, all ethnic groups, all racial groups, ethnic groups, coloured groups, whatever, on the face of the earth, we are all descended from the survivors of Noah's flood. The Bible is very clear on that there were 8 people in the ark and everybody on the face of the earth is descended from them. And of course that was only about 4,300 years ago, and people were all together, mixing together for 5 generations after that. And the dispersion only came after the Tower of Babel, which was only a little over 4,000 years ago. So every ethnic group, including our Aboriginal people, cannot have been anywhere in the world any longer than about 4,000 years. That's what the Bible clearly tells us. So where does this other figure come from? Well, it's very interesting that up until about the 1960s, the secular science generally thought that the Aboriginal people had been here about 13,000 years, which is obviously a bit more than 4,000, but not astronomical like 50,000. Yeah. And then a burnt skeleton was discovered near Lake Mungo in western New South Wales. And they thought that the skeleton was female, and this skeleton was given the name Mungo Woman. Yeah. And carbon dating on the bone gave a date of 19,000, and carbon dating on some of the collagen tissue from the same skeleton gave a date of 24,700. So quite a discrepancy from samples from exactly the same skeleton. Yeah. And then it was found in close proximity to fire, and so dating of the charcoal gave a date of about 26,000. So, I mean, we've mentioned before, people are looking to get the oldest possible date they can. So, of course, 26,000 was then regarded as being the age. So we've jumped from 13,000 years of Aboriginal history in Australia to 26,000. Okay, well, a few years later, another skeleton was discovered in the same area, and this was thought to be male, and he was called Mungo Man. Yeah. Right? But they applied another dating technique to some of the sand surrounding this skeleton, a technique called thermoluminescence, where you heat up the sand and it gives off light, and by using various calculations you come up with a date. Well, the sand gave a date of 42,000 years. Okay, well, of course, that's very exciting, isn't it? Because now we can push the date out from 26,000 to 42,000. So that's what happened. And then a few years later, a few other techniques were thrown into the ring, and they came up with a date of 62,000. Well, you know, obviously 62,000 is even more exciting than 42,000. But that would have thrown the whole evolutionary dating system of the entire world into chaos. So they couldn't really accept that date. So they settled on about 50,000. And that's where the 50,000 has come from. Right. It has not come from Aboriginal history. You see, the Aboriginal people didn't keep a calendar, and all they could say was that they had been here a long time. Yeah. Well, how long's a long time? How long's a piece of string? It can be any time at all. But, of course, there's a lot of kudos in being here for a very, very, very long time. So they're now accepting that 50,000 is the time. But it hasn't come from Aboriginal history.
Yeah, it's come from numerous. It is 10 minutes to 9, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. We've been talking about dating methods over the last few weeks. Today, a little bit about radiometric dating, and then a number of different dating methods that were put into the pot when they were trying to work out how old Mungo Woman and Mungo Man were, and it looks like they've come up with dates anything from 13,000 years to 64,000 years, and they've picked a number in between somewhere. Dr. John, it seems a little nuts when the dates are just so spread out from all different dating methods. How can they say any one of them is correct?
Yeah, look, it's very elastic, Mick, and I think our listeners should be able to see that there's not a lot of precision about these dating methods. They're very subjective, and you really get to pick the date that you want it to be. And so there's a very, very wide spread of options, and all of the dates that are picked are much greater than the biblical account will allow. But they don't have any greater validity. And I think Christians don't need to be concerned that the biblical time frame is under any threat, because when you look at the changes of this history of dating over time, you find that the only thing that's constant is the biblical date. All the others are very, very changeable.
Yeah.
But look, there was another issue that I wanted to talk about this morning, Mick, but we're not going to have time to explore it in detail, so we're going to do it again next week.
Yep.
Any of our listeners who were watching the Channel 7 news on Sunday night would have seen that straight after the news they had a program called Phenomenon.
Yes.
And this was an investigation into UAPs, or unidentified aerial phenomena, not UFOs anymore. And it was an hour and a half program, and it was great. Now, there was a lot of interesting stuff that Ross Coulthard aired on that, including a couple of Australian encounters, one at Northwest Cape, which near Exmouth, which I hadn't heard about before. But the other one I had read about was a high school in Melbourne, down on the Mornington Peninsula, and this happened back in the 70s, where a teacher in a class, a science teacher, and quite a lot of the school children saw these flying saucers. So really it was a very, very interesting program, but there's a lot to be said about it, and I don't have time this morning to go into details. But next week, we're going to talk about that, and I'm also going to talk about as I said before, the speed of light and the size of the universe, because they're topics that do bother Christians. You know, I mean, we know that what the speed of light is, and we know that the universe is believed to be 13 billion light years across, remembering a light year is a measure of distance, not of time. But logic suggests that if it's that big, then maybe it's got to have been around 13 billion years. Well, not necessarily, and that's what we're going to talk about next week.
Ooh, that sounds exciting. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Of course, they do have a website, creation.com, where you can go to get pretty much any questions answered. Although, if you do have a question, we'd really appreciate you sending it through to us, because if you have a question, chances are somebody else has that same question, and we'd love to answer it on air. If you send those questions through to our text line, 0401 949 949. That is SMS 0401 949.